Thank you, Your Grace, Archbishop of Canterbury, 001. I'm most grateful for the flexibility over timing. In response to the motion for the adjournment, I felt obliged to say something about what was in the minds of those in the House of Bishops who voted for this controversial amendment 51C. It comes, as I think has been said already, from a very deep desire among the members of the House of Bishops, the overwhelming majority of members of the House, that this measure to allow women to be bishops should pass and pass promptly. And on my own part, that rests on the conviction that, as I think I said at a meeting in Lambeth Palace last year, we need the deepening, enriching, and, yes, humanizing presence of women in the House of Bishops and in the Church more widely in this ministry, and we need it urgently. And nothing has made me think again about that conviction, that theological conviction. I hope and pray too, as do, I believe, all the members of the House of Bishops, that when this legislation is passed, it will feel like something that the Church of England can celebrate together, something which is, as the Archdeacon just said, good news for all, a true witness to Jesus Christ in the world. So why have the bishops done what they have done? Why have they, to use one phrase that's been around, destabilized the process? The bishops were persuaded, that is, the majority who voted for this amendment, the bishops were persuaded that two particular problems remained. And I want to suggest that the debate today is not just about the precise wording of the proposed amendment 51C, but about whether the bishop's diagnosis is right, that there is some unfinished business here. Much of the reaction in recent weeks has apparently assumed that the measure was as good as it could be, and that it was pretty much assured of passage prior to the amendments being proposed. The majority of the bishops in the House were not convinced of this, despite the heroic efforts of the Revision Committee and the Steering Committee, to which I'd want to pay tribute. And they were not convinced, not simply because they had been got at, because they had been intensively pressurized by one or another group, but in large part because of their reading of their own dioceses' situations and indeed of the views of their diocesan representatives in Synod. So what are the problems? What was the diagnosis? First of all, there was the sheer pragmatic uncertainty about the passage of the measure, based on an analysis of patterns of synod voting and what people knew of their diocesan situations. Given that, it's not wholly surprising that if one adjustment would increase the chance of the measure passing, it was going to be very attractive, especially given that theological conviction is already mentioned in the measure. And what was proposed was seen, to borrow Mr. Malcaron's words, as spelling out explicitly what was already there implicitly, in a way that would give a required minimum of assurance to those with abiding reservations. That was one bit of the diagnosis. The second, though, is a little more complex, and I do urge you to give some thought to this. In the existing 2.1 of the measure, there is no reference to the theological conviction or anything else about the male bishop. And the worry that some people have had is that the lack of any wording beyond that simple male bishop phrase risks something quite serious. It risks suggesting that because no other criteria than maleness are mentioned here, suggesting that any criterion other than maleness is irrelevant, it risks suggesting that what we are accommodating in this is sheer unwillingness to see a woman in episcopal ministry. In other words, it risks accommodating precisely the kind of misogyny that I hope the Synod will have no time for. It is accommodating what we ought not to accommodate. The amendment proposed seeks to address that worry, which I have to say is a real concern of my own. I appreciate that this argument cuts no ice with those who don't think that there is anyway any legitimate theological ground for opposition to women as bishops. But that is not quite where the Church is, or where it has been for the last few decades. The question is, do we want provision that is acceptable only to untheological prejudice or sheer unthinking conservatism? That would be, I believe, offensive not only to those who resist the ordination of women as bishops and their integrity, it would be offensive to women, at least as profoundly as what has been suggested as an amendment. So the bishops were trying to honour two principles, two rather basic practical principles: willing the end by willing the means, and trying to observe also that the best can be the enemy of the good. I hope they were also trying to honour the much more deeply grounded desire to find a resolution that was something which everyone could be grateful for. We did not succeed in that. Much of the hostile comment that has been around outside the synod in the more general public seems to suggest that people have not actually read the text of the unamended measure, and I suspect that some of the anger and strong feeling around is, as it were, the expression of deep frustrations, to use that word again, with the unamended measure anyway, even before the bishops got their hands on it. However, to say that is not to close the discussion down, because it's quite clear that the reaction cannot be ignored. When there is a reaction of real hurt and offence in the church at large, Christians, and Christian pastors particularly, cannot afford to ignore it, because it means that should the measure go through with that in the background, it's not easily something that can be celebrated by the church as a whole. And the bishops will be aware that they underrated the depth of that sense of hurt and offence. And if other bishops feel as I do, they will need to examine themselves and feel appropriate penitence that they did not recognize just how difficult that was going to be. So we have a diagnosis of the situation, a possible solution which the bishops advanced, and now a deeply complex and rather conflicted situation. The adjournment gives us at least a chance of lowering temperatures and explaining ourselves to each other. The communication of the bishop's decision was not ideal, I think it can be said, and some of the reaction has been based on flawed communication. But not all. The questions are real enough. And it's in the light of all that that I want to say that I do not at the moment feel I want to resist the adjournment. I would like to hear a long debate on this, but that's where I stand at the moment. But, and it's a large but, I would want to say to Synod, the adjournment is not a panacea, nor should it be seen as a squaring off to the House of Bishops. It should be seen as an opportunity. And although it may sound a little bit over-optimistic to say so, I hope we can say that an adjournment might be good for us, if that's what we decide, that it might be an opportunity to do something better. I don't myself feel convinced that we were wrong in the wording we selected, but that's clearly a conviction that has now to be tested and discussed. So, if Synod is minded to go with the adjournment, it will need, I believe, to commit itself to helping the bishops in the task that is ahead of them. There's no point in crafting an extremely complicated compromise that doesn't work or works best for those we are least eager to accommodate. The bishops are not infallible, no news there, but the bishops do have a responsibility for the oversight of the faith and discipline of the church. Synodical government means that bishops invite others to join them in exercising that responsibility as responsibly and effectively as they can. If the adjournment passes, that is what we are committing ourselves to do. As bishops, inviting others to join them in discharging the responsibility they hold. As a synod generally, discerning as carefully and prayerfully as possible whether the bishop's diagnosis of the unfinished business is correct. As I say, I shall listen to the debate. I'm saying, as precisely as I can, I shall not resist the adjournment. If, by some miracle, Synod feels corporately that it can confidently go forward to final approval today, well and good, and I, for one, shall be very grateful. But I put this before you as a way of understanding what the adjournment might entail in the light of what I understand the bishops to have been trying to do, and commend this very, very difficult question to more thoughtful and prayerful discussion this morning.